Okay, so today's deep dive, well, you found a really interesting one from flagrant clips,
Hmm.
right? A divorce lawyer sharing their experiences,
Right.
and maybe more accurately, stereotypes
Yeah,
they've
definitely.
observed in their practice about how like cultural background could actually play a role in divorce.
Interesting.
So we have the transcript right here in front of us,
Okay.
and I think our aim is to kind of go through it and see like what these anecdotal perspectives, are on things like ruthlessness, emotional responses, um, attitudes towards infidelity.
Yeah, how that all plays out.
And it's important, right off the bat that this is like one person's, professional experiences and generalizations, right?
Of course,
This
yeah.
isn't like
This isn't a sociological study.
right, exactly right.
These are just
Oh,
not a scientific paper.
this is like, from the trenches, sort of.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
anecdotal evidence, but
Yeah.
that can be interesting too. But it is interesting. It's fascinating. And I think it, allows us to maybe examine some potential underlying cultural nuances that might shape perceptions and behaviors in divorce.
Exactly.
So let's get into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I mean the first one that the lawyer talks about is Russian women.
Okay.
And he uses some strong language.
Yeah.
He even mentions like this nickname, the Red Menace,
Oh, wow.
that's supposedly used in the courthouse.
Oh, my goodness.
So, yeah, the central theme is that they're like incredibly ruthless in divorce.
Okay.
He even states this like dynamic that when you're married to a Russian woman, there's nothing she won't do for you, and when you're divorcing a Russian woman, there's nothing she won't do to you.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, like this very intense picture, right?
Yeah, like a complete 180.
Right. Exactly.
Like ride or die, but then like ride or die against you.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
That's fascinating.
What are your thoughts on this initially?
I mean, it's really interesting how he frames that as like this huge shift, from like complete devotion, and then it's like bam, the switch flips, and it's like scorched earth.
All right.
I guess it makes you think about whether there are like maybe cultural norms at play there that emphasize a more assertive approach to protecting one's interests
Right.
when a significant relationship dissolves.
Totally. I mean, you think about like the history of
Yeah, I suppose.
Russia and the the culture of like strength and resilience.
Right. It's a very like what's the word I'm looking for? Like a strong,
Yeah. Yeah.
like powerful,
That's right.
just kind of like presence.
Yeah, for sure.
So maybe that translates in some way.
Yeah, and he does mention some specifics.
Okay.
He talks about surveillance of the husband,
Oh, wow.
reporting them to the IRS,
Oh my goodness.
and even has like a little anecdote about a client who had already done it,
Oh,
and he was like surprised by it.
wow.
He's like, "Oh, you already called the IRS?"
Like going right for the jugular.
Yeah, yeah,
That's intense.
yeah. So so this definitely creates an image
Hmm.
of very decisive and perhaps uncompromising action.
Yeah.
Like they're not messing around.
Yeah, no kidding.
So I don't know. I mean, it's just interesting.
I think it's interesting too how that plays into like if you think about broader social science concepts,
Right.
it makes you think about how different cultures, socialize individuals to handle conflict
Right.
and kind of protect their assets or perceived rights
Yeah.
during significant life changes like a divorce.
Yeah. Are there certain, societal norms in some regions
Right.
that might make like such direct action more common or more expected?
It's a good question.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Definitely.
Moving on, he then talks about Latina women,
Okay.
and the stereotype he presents shifts quite a bit here,
Okay.
more towards like intense emotional reaction
Okay.
and suspicion.
Got it.
The example he uses is someone burning the house down and then immediately asking about another woman.
Oh.
So it's certainly a very vivid and emotionally charged image.
Yeah. Very dramatic.
Right.
You know. I guess it kind of plays into the stereotype we often see that associates certain cultures,
Right.
with more outwardly expressive emotional responses,
Yeah.
particularly in matters of like, love and betrayal.
Right.
And it raises this question of like how different cultures might display and process emotional pain and anger
Yeah.
within the context of a relationship ending.
Right. Could there be cultural norms around the expression of strong emotions that might contribute to these stereotypes, even if they don't reflect the reality for every individual?
I mean, that's possible, right?
right? It's totally possible. Yeah,
That's
so
too complicated.
it's super complicated.
Yeah.
There's so many factors.
Okay. So then we get to Italian women.
Okay.
And this is where things take a turn.
Right.
He suggests a potential acceptance of infidelity,
Oh, interesting.
but with a very specific discretion.
Okay.
Like, it's okay as long as it's on the DL.
Yeah.
Keep it quiet.
Exactly. And the quote that stood out to me was, "Don't bring your fucking whore around people."
Oh, wow. Okay, so very specific.
Yeah. Very specific.
So it's not about the act itself. It's about the
right.
the
The public display.
the embarrassment.
Yeah, the public embarrassment of it.
Yeah.
And it really highlights this distinction between the act of infidelity itself and the public embarrassment it might cause.
It's about saving face in a way,
Right. Exactly.
like protecting that social image.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
It's a totally different way of looking at it.
Right.
So what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's so interesting how it contrasts with, those previous examples we were talking about.
Right.
Right? Like this idea that infidelity might be tolerated as long as it remains private
Yeah.
suggests a totally different set of priorities. Like
right.
cultural priorities within the relationship. Like maybe the focus shifts from the sanctity of fidelity itself to the preservation of social appearances,
Right.
And avoiding public shame.
Right. Like keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak.
Exactly, yeah. And it really makes you consider how different cultures balance individual behavior with the collective reputation of the family or the social group.
Yeah. And how that all plays into these, decisions and
Absolutely. Yeah.
intersections.
It can be fascinating.
Yeah. And the lawyer himself,
Mhm.
who mentions being of German background,
Okay.
admits that he doesn't fully understand this perspective.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he's like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
And he emphasizes that it's really about if friends see the husband with another woman, you making a fool of me, that's a different vibe.
Okay, so it's about respect in a way.
Yeah. Like public respect
Yeah.
and not being humiliated.
Not being made to look bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
it's not so much about the act itself, it's about the social consequences.
Right, the fallout from it.
Right.
It's-
Yeah. And so this kind of leads us naturally into this broader idea of like cultural influences on marriage and divorce.
Yeah, how these bigger societal norms play a role.
Right. And the lawyer touches on this by suggesting that observing parents' marriages and family norms can normalize certain attitudes.
Right, like what you grew up seeing, basically.
Right, exactly. And it makes sense what you grow up seeing can shape your expectations and understanding of relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of, sociological research on this too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, about how we learn about relationships, in part by observing
Right.
the dynamics and the norms within our own families and communities.
That makes sense.
So, if certain behaviors or ways of handling marital issues are common or accepted within a cultural context,
Yeah.
they can become normalized, for individuals growing up in that environment.
Right. Yeah, like it's just the water you swim in.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just what you're used to.
Yeah, so then he touches on this idea that different cultures might value different things in a relationship.
Okay, so like different priorities.
Right, different priorities.
Yeah.
And he mentioned the possibility that some cultures might place more emphasis on a husband being a provider and protector,
Okay.
and perhaps view infidelity as less significant in comparison to those roles.
Interesting. So it's like a trade-off almost.
Yeah.
Like as long as you're fulfilling those primary duties,
Right.
the other stuff might be seen as,
Less important.
less of a deal breaker.
Yeah. And I thought that was a really interesting point. Like, if a culture prioritizes economic stability and the fulfillment of traditional gender roles,
Yeah.
then individual acts of infidelity might be seen as less disruptive
Right.
to the overall structure of the relationship.
Right. Like as long as the family unit is functioning.
Right, as long as
Yeah.
those primary responsibilities are met.
Exactly. And that contrasts, really sharply with cultures that place a very high value on emotional intimacy
Yeah.
and strict sexual exclusivity as the foundational elements of marriage.
Right, like that's the bedrock.
Yeah, that's the core.
Yeah.
Interesting how different things can be emphasized.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So this brings us to the comparison between American and European perspectives on fidelity.
Okay. Interesting.
And the lawyer suggests that American culture might place a significantly higher emphasis on fidelity compared to some European cultures.
Really?
Yeah. He even brings up the French
Okay.
and kind of portrays a more perhaps accepting,
The more relaxed attitude.
yeah, more relaxed attitude, or even charming view of infidelity.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I thought that was really interesting.
It is interesting. It makes you think about that concept of cultural relativism.
Right.
You know, the idea that norms and values
Yeah.
can vary so much across different cultures.
Yeah.
You know, what is considered like a serious breach of trust in one culture might be viewed with more nuance or even a degree of acceptance in another.
Right, totally. And it's like, what is considered cheating?
Exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
like
It's subjective.
it's super subjective.
Yeah.
And he makes a distinction between a brief dalliance,
Okay.
like a fleeting, perhaps insignificant encounter.
Like a one-time thing
Yeah, a one-time thing.
versus like a full-blown affair.
Yeah, versus an ongoing affair, and how these might be perceived differently across cultures.
So the context matters a lot.
The context matters hugely.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important distinction, right? Like a one-time slip-up might be viewed very differently from a sustained emotional and physical relationship outside the marriage.
Right. And that probably plays into how different cultures categorize and judge these behaviors.
Yeah.
Like, you know, a brief encounter might be rationalized as a momentary lapse.
Yeah, like a mistake.
Yeah. Whereas an ongoing affair might be seen as a fundamental violation of trust and commitment.
Yeah, like a betrayal.
Exactly.
So it's all about like the perceived intent behind the infidelity, the level of emotional investment,
Right.
and the potential for long-term impact on the core relationship.
Exactly. All those factors come into play.
Yeah. So then this all circles back to like the practical aspects.
Okay.
And the lawyer then discusses prenuptial agreements
Okay.
and this increasing, though often complex, inclusion of infidelity clauses.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he highlights the challenge of like legally defining infidelity.
Right. Because how do you put that into like legal terms?
Right.
That's tricky.
It's super tricky, and I love the examples that he uses.
Okay.
Like, is a drunken kiss with someone else considered the same as ongoing intimate text conversations?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Two very different things.
Right.
But both could be considered infidelity depending on, you know,
Exactly.
lots of types.
And legally, these are vastly different scenarios
Right.
when trying to prove a breach of contract.
Exactly.
So it's like, how do you actually enforce these things?
It gets messy, I imagine.
Super messy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he even says, you know, the legal system often deals with tangible and demonstrable actions.
Right.
Emotional intimacy, while potentially deeply damaging to a relationship, is much harder to define and prove in a legal context.
Right. You can't really quantify that.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's all about feelings.
Right. And this is a key reason why he says these infidelity clauses in prenups
Yeah.
can often lead to disputes and difficulties in enforcement.
They're just too hard to pin down.
Right. And then he shares this anecdote about the weirdest infidelity clause he had seen,
Oh, really?
which went into minute detail defining oral, genital, and even digital to genital contact.
Oh, my goodness.
And his reaction is like hilarious. He's like,
Like, what is this?
yeah, it's so specific.
So specific.
And then he immediately identifies like potential loopholes, like the absence of a definition for anal contact.
He found the loophole right away.
Right away, he's like, well, what about
You're a
this?
classic lawyer.
Yeah, totally.
So thinking outside the box.
It really illustrates the limitations of trying to regulate the complexities of human relationships
Right.
through like overly specific legal definitions.
You can't put it all in a contract.
Right, you just can't.
Life is too messy.
Yeah, life's too messy. Yeah, so to kind of bring this all together, this deep dive into this lawyer's observations.
Okay.
You know, we explored these interesting, though definitely stereotypical viewpoints on how cultural backgrounds might intersect with divorce.
Yeah.
We looked at, you know, anecdotes about Russian women being perceived as ruthless, Latina women as emotionally reactive, and Italian women as potentially more accepting of infidelity under specific conditions.
Right. A whole range of perspectives.
Right. And then we talked about kind of broader cultural attitudes towards marriage and fidelity,
Yeah.
comparing American and European perspectives.
It's a lot to unpack.
A lot to unpack. Yeah.
But I think it's important for our listeners to remember, you know, these are broad generalizations
Right.
drawn from one individual's professional experiences.
Right. This isn't the end all be all.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And while, you know, they might prompt some interesting reflections on cultural norms,
Yeah.
they shouldn't be seen as like definitive characterizations of entire groups of people. Individuals within any culture will always vary significantly.
Of course. Of course.
And it's just crucial to approach stereotypes with a critical eye, you know? recognizing that they often oversimplify complex realities.
Absolutely. Yeah, so having considered all this, all
Yeah.
these cultural perspectives on relationships and divorce,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on the most significant underlying values that might shape how different cultures approach commitment betrayal and the dissolution of marriage?
Hmm. That's a big question.
The big
A
question.
lot to think about there.
Yeah, and do you think these broad cultural strokes truly influence the diverse experiences of individuals?
I don't know. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah,
Something to ponder for sure.
it's a complex and fascinating area to consider.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
It was a good one.
It was a good one.